Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker. Dr. Michael Heiser is a scholar in the fields of biblical studies in the ancient Near East and is the executive director of the Awakening School of Ministry at Celebration Church in Jacksonville, Florida. He holds a PhD in Hebrew, Bible, and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. You can learn more about Dr. Heiser and his writings at drmsh.com. He's the author of The Unseen Realm, Supernatural, Angels, Reversing Herman, The World Turned Upside Down, The Gospel According to Stranger Things. He's written a companion to the Book of Enoch. You can find out more about him at his website, also the Naked Podcast. Here to discuss all things biblical and insights into his newest #1 new release on Amazon, Demons, What the Bible Really Says About the Powers of Darkness, is our good friend, Dr. Michael Heiser, seen here on the third Monday of every month in the 12 o'clock hour. Mike, good to see you, my friend.
Good to see you. I'm trying to suppress a chuckle because we should tell your listeners that it's the Naked Bible Podcast, not the Naked Podcast.
That's right. It's the Naked Bible. That's right.
I do not do the podcast
right,
naked.
Right. That is a point of clarification that needs to be made because just the imagery of you coming out coming out of your conservative upbringing in central Pennsylvania, where I went to college, not far from there, and where I was the chairman of the Messiah Conference for many years at Grantham, at Messiah College in Grantham. Kind of interesting stuff that, no, you do not do it naked, but it's the Naked Bible podcast. So that is an important distinction, and I'm glad you brought that up. So how are you adjusting? You're in a new city, you're quarantined, and you had, this is of course supernatural insight to start a virtual, you have an in-person class as well, but you also have a larger virtual base for this new coursework you're doing there at the Awakening School of Ministry based on the Unseen Realm, which to me is still, I have 3 copies. I have a copy here in the studio, I have a copy in my office, and I have a copy at home of the Unseen Realm. So I like the fact that Lexham actually sends me
that's good.
As much as they send me, because I have my own little. I don't have a candle, and I don't have a picture, and I don't have a shrine. Not a very Jewish thing to do, but the Unseen Realm is just for any believer, if you have not embraced this continually. After how many years now has it been a bestseller?
Since 2015. Yeah, it has long legs, and I think it will continue to, to be something that people read. To me, as well as it's done, it's sort of just a good start. Scratching the surface, because it hasn't penetrated into lots of different, areas of the church. So, I fully expect it to, be something that, will be useful for a long time. I don't think its use has been, sort of, past, been there, done that. I think it'll be useful for a good time to come.
To position it properly, it is a, and you said this in one of your podcasts that just made so much sense to me, and I never really thought about it before. You were talking about the Masters of Divinity, and that it's 1 inch thick and miles wide.
Mile wide, yeah.
And that this is not a negative commentary, it's what it's supposed to be. You have a master's in divinity of all the segments of that which involves the understanding of the concepts. But in order to drill down, which a pastor does not, and in many cases, the gifting in the spiritual gifts, teaching and preaching are not always universally bound together in a single individual. There are those that have the gift of preaching that are the worst teachers I've ever heard teach. They don't know how to teach. They're just not gifted in teaching, but they're a great preacher. I've had great teachers that couldn't put together a message to save your life.
Right.
And isn't that what the message is about, is saving your life? But every spiritual gifts inventory I ever did gave me 3 equal scores: preaching, teaching, administration. And they were all equal, and then everything else fell off. I have no hospitality whatsoever. I have
Tell people that's why I'm not fit to pastor. I hit the gift of hospitality, and I'm just a train wreck. So.
There it is. I'm an equal opportunity offender. I would start my messages by saying, if this message, and during this message I stepped on your toes, next week please move your feet, because I'm not going to change the message. But we have this desire to go deeper. And when we have that desire to go deeper, that burden is not in the realm of possibly our pastor in the church. He may not be, and that's why I think that I just read an article that Jan Markle put out that said that based on a survey, 90% of pastors don't talk about the prophetic. They don't talk about the supernatural. They don't talk about the end time prophecies. But she's hoping that this virus and that this is drawing people into looking at the Matthew 24 sequence of pestilences and being a sign of the times, that hopefully the pastors would start preaching a little bit more about this area. They get a smattering of teachings in the MDiv program, but it's not really considered. You know, they talk about the fact whoever got saved by preaching the book of Revelation. Well, oddly enough, this movie that I wrote you about over the weekend came out, and I saw it. I came to faith in December of 1996. It came out in early 1998. And I saw it, and it opened up my eyes to the demonic, because there was a theologian in the movie who plays a part in the movie that talks about the scriptural reference to the demonic. And that got me interested in saying, okay, you know, I've been in the synagogue all my life and studied with rabbis all my life. I was always a student, always spent extra time, 2 hours a week, lunches, dinners, extra time studying with rabbis and having great favor. I was a big donor, so I you know, they were a Pharisee, and they gave me a good seat. But there were questions that I had that couldn't be answered. Questions about Genesis chapter 3. Where in the Tanakh was this fulfilled? Where did this get completed? Where did the seed of the woman crush the head of the seed of the serpent? Where? And they really got angry with me. I kept asking these kind of probative questions, saying in Ezekiel, why doesn't he call the king the king? Why does he call him the prince? He's got the job of the king. Well, why does God refer to him as the prince of Tyre? Why doesn't he call him the king of Tyre? And they would get angry with me and say, you're not asking the right questions. What you should be asking are Talmudic questions. You know, how many angels can fit on the head of a pin? Okay, this is the kind of stuff we want you to learn. And I was kept going back to the scriptures because I was reading it, and I didn't know that as a Jew that wasn't our standard operating procedure, was to read the Bible. You know, silly me. But there's also extra biblical text, and for early on, I became, at 40, I left the synagogue and went on a spiritual quest, and it was a global spiritual quest that took me all the way back home to coming to faith in a Messianic synagogue. But I had spent time in Israel, I spent time in India, I spent time in Nepal. This was a time of really looking at belief systems and what was authentic and what was counterfeit. And I came across, of course, extra-biblical text, and extra-biblical, which in my mind, the Talmud was never presented to me as extra-biblical. It was always more discussion about the Talmud than the Torah. So you honestly believe that as it was written was actually out of the Bible until I found out it wasn't. That this was a commentary, that this was an expository, this was actually a contemporary document that was, second, third century document, as opposed to something that goes back to the time of the, let's call it the 4,500 or 5,000 year period. But then we come to books which were not canonized that you refer to, that I refer to, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Book of Jubilee, Book of Enoch, that are weighty and credible, but not canonized. And you and I take a lot of our theology and expanding the scope by including these documents into our biblical, the Bible prevails. These are supporting. It's like supporting evidence in a court case. It's not, the Bible is the main.
It's like secondary sources.
Exactly. Most in the church, most of our audience doesn't know anything about the Dead Sea Scrolls. They don't know anything about the book. Well, they learned about the Book of Enoch in our show. So they're looking at this and saying, okay, he's written about angels, and we talked about that. Now he's written about demons, and in this intertestamental period, the 400 years during the Greek to Roman transition of the rulership of Israel, a lot of things happened that were influenced those that wanted to break away from what was the assimilation and the really eliminating the text and elevating the person. The Bible relegated almost to philosophical as opposed to absolute. And there were people that broke away from that, and that's who you and I look at, were the spiritual authorities that really dug deeper into the text to reveal things that weren't included in the original text.
Going back to your entry point here, the pastor, the average person in the pew who really wants to sort of move past the church narrative of Scripture, the stuff you hear in church, they're in a difficult spot because, pastors have, let's just be honest, pastors have a rough job. They get people for 30 minutes a week. They can preach them a message. They always have a mixed congregation. There's going to be a mixture of believers and unbelievers in there. So there is a certain logic to making every message about the gospel. But for the person in the who's been there for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and this is their half an hour a week, that gets boring. I mean, they don't progress much beyond that point. And not only do pastors, they're in this pickle, so to speak. I mean, we could sit here and if we wanted to pick at them, and we could say, well, have an hour a week where you just do instruction. Okay, have a Bible Institute. I grew up in a church that did that, and I'm still in some ways living off the capital, of that investment. But be that as it may, this is the reality of ministry. And then during the week, their time is absorbed with counseling, and that's a serious issue because, so many people within the church need it. They're broken, just varying degrees of severity. It's a tough spot. And so pastors have that problem. They also have a training problem, which you alluded to, the MDiv. It by design, it is an inch deep and a mile wide, but that's what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be your entry point as someone who's going to essentially get paid vocationally to do ministry. You need exposure to everything, and that's what it gives you. The MDiv does its job, but it's sort of a handcuff at the same time. It's supposed to give you the tools to keep studying, but then you wind up in ministry. And it's like, well, who can do that? It's a difficult situation just across the board. And so when you don't have, either knowledge of material that can supplement what your pastor gives you, you don't know about the academic community, you don't know about the academic world, then what do? Well, we're back to the Middle Earth illustration here. You either bag it, well, I'm going to stop asking my questions, or I'm going to leave the faith. I mean, which is, never an intelligent response. But, this is where people go, or they just bubble up or find the internet and YouTube, and then that becomes their classroom. And you can find good stuff there, but you find an awful lot of nonsense. And that's the problem. That's the fundamental problem. So what I try to do is try to fill that void. I try to take academic material and, formulate it and package it in such a way that the average person can comprehend it and get something, out of it, to try to be useful here. And in the process of doing that, it introduces people to the other thing you just brought up, and that is, to understand Scripture, we have to realize that the biblical writers were people, and they are informed not just by immediate context, their immediate community, Jewish community, and even wider than the average Christian thinks. But they're informed by the wideness of not only that community, but the wideness of the intellectual discourse, of their time period, whether that be an Old Testament writer and all the things that pull at Israelites for their faith and their intellectual, loyalty, or whether that's a first century Jew, which has this, again, the same kinds of pulls. What are you going to believe? And so there's lots of people thinking about, the Old Testament. There's lots of people thinking about the God of Israel, and who should we be loyal to? I mean, this is just the way life is. And biblical writers interact with the wider discussion basically on every page of Scripture. And if you don't know they're doing that, and you don't know how to get to those sources, you're not going to be able to understand most of what they write. You can get surface understanding, but it can be very frustrating. And one of these things is the Dead Sea Scrolls. We're talking really about non-biblical scrolls. I mean, the Dead Sea Scrolls you can put in two piles. There's copies of the Bible, then there's material written either about the Bible or about the life of the community. Okay, so we're talking about the second bucket there. And what are they doing? Well, they're looking at their Bible, and they're thinking, wow, what does this mean? How do I connect all these dots? Look at what God says here, 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 and here. How do we put these things together and do exegesis and do theology? How can our community take the sacred text here and understand it, know what it's really getting at? And so they think about that, and they write a lot of stuff about that. And so when you read that material, it helps you not only know how someone else is thinking about the Scripture, it helps you, it alerts you to things that you really do need to think about. You might not buy what this author's saying, but you may not have even been aware that, wow, that's really an issue. That's really an interesting observation. I never would have seen that had I not read this book. And Enoch is one of those books. Enoch, again, was part of the sort of the Dead Sea Scroll curriculum. It was held in high esteem there. And so there's this massive body of material that the biblical writers are in communication with, and they repurpose they repurpose that material on a number of points. And if you don't know that, you're not going to be able, again, to understand what they wrote. And you're also not going to be able to really comprehend what needs thinking, what needs to be part of how you think theologically about the content of your Old Testament in this case, but even the content of the New Testament, because the New Testament writers are doing this all the time. They're interacting with this stuff. And so that's what brings a richness and a greater fullness to understanding the content of both Testaments in their own context. But unless you have somebody that's sort of out there waving that flag, okay, I mean, and you wave the flag on your show, I wave the flag on my podcast and in the books, but unless you run into somebody waving the flag, you're just not going to, where are you going to find that? You might hit it on the internet, but will you know that it's any good? Will you know that it's rooted in exegesis? Will you know that the secondary sourcing is peer reviewed? You're not going to know any of that. It's just a total, hodgepodge. And you're left at the mercy of whoever's producing that content and putting it online. And they may or may not have the slightest clue about what they're doing. And so what we're trying to do here is trying to fix that a little bit. I mean, neither of us are under the delusion that we're just going to fix this.
No.
But you can do something about it. I mean, you can step into the space and contribute something worthwhile and hope people find it. That's what you can do.
It's interesting that we look at the writings of the scribe Eusebius, who chronicled what became the foundation of the Roman Catholic Church, the doctrine of the Trinity, many of the things Constantine and his mother in 325 AD declared, Sunday being the Sabbath, the elimination of Passover worship, and Easter being, or the resurrection being, what was going to be celebrated. And the foundational, and many in the Catholic Church are educated through their course study on the history of the Catholic Church, and so they become much more zealous. I find that Catholics the Catholics I've come across very zealous for the Catholic Church as being the only real true church. You don't hear that in a lot of evangelical circles, but they refer to historical documents where the church has just 500 years of the reformers that they consider to be the foundation for what they're teaching. So whether or not they're following Luther, or whether or not they're following Calvin, or whether or not they're following one of the reformers. And the truth of the matter is that the access to the Tanakh, to the Hebrew text, to the Dead Sea Scrolls, to the knowledge of who authored them and what their position was in the community would be a distinguished group of scholars. This was the highest level, highest order, if you will, of peer-reviewed scholarly writings and study in all of Israel. So much so that they didn't even have community with women. They didn't have community with others, but yet they're actually referenced uniquely.
The people at Qumran were not theological liberals.
No.
I mean, when you're breaking off from the Pharisees because you don't like the calendar they use, you got your head really into this stuff. You're taking it really seriously. If you're willing to go out and live in the desert and pretend that you have a temple there, because you're not going to do your thing in the temple in Jerusalem because the Pharisees control that, you're pretty serious. You're not taking it lightly.
So I do have a sidebar question for you. So when Jesus said, "Go to the man carrying water," Was that man an Essene? Because that was a woman's job to carry water.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it could be. You know,
The-
they. It's not that an Essene wouldn't dare to be caught dead in Jerusalem.
Right,
They're just not participating
right.
in the institutionalized Judaism of the day.
Yeah, I think it's a possible scenario.
There are a number of scholars, and I'll just throw this out. There are a number of scholars that believe that because of the Qumran calendar, you had all these competing calendar systems. The Sadducees had one, the Pharisees had one. They were the dominant ones that, dictated the temple. The Essenes had one. And they're all trying to do calculations based on the sabbatical year and the Jubilees and whatnot, either going backward into history and going forward. And so, because the Essene system, based on where it starts, the fourth day of creation, and then you move forward, doing these cycles of 490. Again, these it's the Jubilee times 10. These 10-year segments. They're 10-year collectives of Jubilees, and 10 of those, 4,900 years, based upon where they start. That's when they expected the Messiah, and theirs is the only system that actually falls. I mean, it varies. Like, is it 49 or 50 year? Because there's some variance here. It accumulates over time, but theirs is the only system that had the Messiah coming back at the time when Jesus was actually born. Now, we know that in hindsight, just because we can do math. And there are a number of scholars that feel that because of that, when Jesus comes along and starts doing what he does, that a lot of the people at Qumran became Christians. They became followers of Jesus because he matched their expectations. They believed his message. So it is kind of interesting that you have some of these oblique possible sort of intersections. Mm-hmm. In the Gospels, but that's not an internet suspicion. I mean, you can find that in the literature, that scholars wonder out loud. Well, boy, that if I was in a scene, I'd be really tempted to follow this guy and believe what he says, because he meets these expectations.
Is that where the 70 times 7 reference comes from?
Yeah, everybody figures that Daniel, the 70 weeks, the 490 there, which of course can also be calculated by a number of Jubilee cycles, right. 10. So,
but I was thinking about forgiving your brother, not 7 times, but 7 times.
No,
7.
It does, because just as the Jubilee was a reset button, it was a reboot. Okay, and so essentially the messaging is, you need to reboot that relationship as many times as it takes. So there is this sort of thinking that extends abstractly, beyond calendar, into the way we live and behave. There were things that Israelites believed about the land, because they were just tenants. They were leasing the land from Yahweh, who was the true owner, and there's a lot tied to these concepts. The sacred calendar, was not just. The sacred calendar wasn't there just to turn Israelites into like math accountants, or date, chronology accountants. I mean, that you could do that, but it was more meaningful in that it established theological patterns based on Yahweh's character that were supposed to be reflected in life. And I think that's one of the more explicit illustrative examples of how that happened, how that was worked out.
See, once we establish that, then many of the books that you write come into much sharper focus, because there's text that the church is not familiar with, that you introduce into the lexicon of the believing the body, and allow them to expand beyond, so that they can transition almost backwards to being provoked to say, you know what, I really need to read the Old Testament. I really need to go back and look at what occurred in Leviticus 23, what occurred in Genesis 3 and Genesis 6, and understand these principalities and the concept of good and the concept of evil, and Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden. What was that? What is that? Because it still is. We actually read the reference in Revelation to the tree of life being planted and growing on the river of life. And so we know that there's no transplantation that takes place in Scripture where God relocated or uprooted the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and uprooted the tree of life and destroyed the Garden of Eden. No, he put a single cherubim there to protect it. That's one bad dude that I would not want to have a confrontation with. He's not some little fat angel that Hallmark would this little chubby cherub.
Tickle the baby.
Yeah. But what you've done is you've allowed. It's almost like giving permission to say, look, there are other writings, and they're not the standard Christian commentary. They're not the MacArthur. They're not the Wiersbe. They're not great commentators. Okay, there's actually authors who wrote in this period of time that we think John the Baptist might have been connected to for several years, just because of things that he did, things that he said, certain behaviors.
And things he did differently that play off, the other sect, yeah.
Right, and the fact that his father was a Pharisaical, Levitical priest in the temple in the 24 divisions of 1,000 that King David set up to minister in the temple. That's how we know that John came about, but we never hear about him as John the Levite, John the priest. We only hear about him as John the Baptist. So we kind of stripped away some of the identity of some of the key players who contribute to the narrative that our whole faith system of what does light have to do with darkness? What does good have to do with evil? Why is there separate distinction? What do we know about angels? What do we know about demons?
It's all context. It's something you said brought back a good memory to me. When I wish I would have done this, but it was a colleague of mine where I taught at a Bible college, and we were two peas in a pod, But one day in hermeneutics class, he had done this for me privately, and I said, you gotta come to my class and do this, for students. He brought a letter from his mom, into class that he had gotten like 2 weeks earlier. And he said, we're gonna do the exegetical method that you're all used to on this letter from my mom. And it was hilarious. Because by the end of the letter, you had no idea what the letter from mom actually said or meant. You had no idea at all. Because he's taking it apart word by word, tense by tense, all this kind of stuff. And it was comical, but it was to make a point. Look, I know what my mom meant here because I know my mom. I have context. I grew up in her house. These are, half a dozen of these things, if we were living maybe 1,000 years from now, you would look at this letter and draw some of these, questions and conclusions out. You wouldn't know. But if you had known the context, none of these things would be conundra. They would be quite transparent. But the fact is that you're divorced. You don't know my mom. Okay, and if I approach the Scripture this way, the way I approach this letter, look at the result. I'm reading it like it has no context, and when I do that, I'm reading it out of context. I'm not trying to do that. It's nothing sinister. It's just by virtue of the way I'm approaching this, I'm not trying to think like the person who wrote it. I'm thinking like me. I'm asking the questions I would ask because I really can't do anything else. If I had this person sort of, living rent free in my head, if I really knew them and how they thought, this would be so much more comprehensible. And this is the argument that you're making, that I make. Look, biblical writers read books. They had conversations. They knew people in their group and outside their group. They knew their culture, and they write to those people. They're not writing to me 2,000 years later so that they can dispense with all of this context. Okay? They're writing to people alive at the time who they use their culture, they use this other material to connect with them because their audience knows those things. They read them too. They have the same conversations. It's a parochial, discussion. It's an internal discussion between the writer in the first century to readers at the first century. And if we don't approach scripture like that, we can read the words. I could read the letter from mom and I can get something out of it, but all the questions that this turn of a phrase or this allusion create in my head, I got no idea. I've got no idea at all.
We do that to the Gospels. We do that to the letters from Paul. The concept of Christians are born again. This is a term that was coined before there was a New Testament. This was a Jewish concept. This was a rabbi coming to Jesus contextually, and Jesus using terminology that he could relate to because he knows about the breaking through of the water. He knows about Tevila, full water immersion. He knows about the new life that's brought forward every time you wash the sin from you.
Things in your Old Testament have two beginnings.
Right.
That are associated with water. Okay? Let's just take the first question. What things in the Old Testament have two beginnings? Israel.
Yes.
Okay, Israel was born of the flesh, Abraham, and then it's born of water, the deliverance at the Exodus. There's just a lot going on there. Okay?
Yes.
Unless it's one thing to be an ethnic Jew, Jesus talking to Nicodemus, okay? But unless you've been born through a supernatural act, okay, this second birth, and piling on that, the whole notion, the whole parallel between Adam and Israel and Messiah, and now the guy sitting next to him. Okay, unless you're born of that, you're not going to see the kingdom of God. They're just things that are so loaded in terms of conversation that, to your point, we read and then we assign a meaning to them that it's not necessarily a bad meaning, but it's not the context meaning. It doesn't give us any clarity because we've created our own context and then imported that into the passage. And that creates muddled thinking in a number of respects.
The reason we're having the conversation in this discussion the way we're having it is because I want to put foundation stones, cornerstones, and capstones in place for us to build on the concept of your new book, Demons. Mm-hmm. And in order to do that, we have to have the foundation in place under which we're going to build on first debunking what the church believes that's just not true, and having the evidence to disprove it. First of all, because one, it's not in the Bible. Okay, so it's been passed down by tradition. It's like God helps those that help themselves. Thus says the Lord. Yeah, well, guess what? It's not in the Bible. Okay, sorry. I
have to take that off my wall now.
You have to take it off. It's on your wall.
No.
That's right. That says your mother.
Right.
Is exactly, WW. I used to tell people when you're Jewish, all right. See, for a Christian, it's WWJD. Okay.
Yeah.
When you're Jewish, it's WWYMD. Okay. What would your mother do? Okay. So that's see, it's a very different set of context. But in order for us to really grasp this, one, we need to know that there are extra biblical writings that are foundational truths that wound up speaking into especially key players like Paul. Fed into him. He would know of this if we know about his background, if we know about his leadership, if we know why he was believing what he was believing and where he came from the Pharisaical side, and then comes into the knowing side and embraces new understanding because he was scholarly. He was a man of letters. I mean, this is what when we think about you are a man of letters. You have a PhD. You're a man of letters. We think of this concept of educated and well trained and the training of others. In order to create, in this case, some of the foundational truths, we have to dispel some of the foundational misunderstandings that exist today. And I wanted to make sure that people understood that there are things that they believe that aren't in the Bible, that we can find supporting documentation for some of it in some of these secondary sources. But then again, we can find that there is no support whatsoever for the position. And a part of that has to do with our basic understanding of Genesis and the Genesis 6 and the actual words about the Nephilim that would be there before the flood and after the flood. And the wording is very clear. It's a before and after scenario. People don't think about that.
Well, one of the things that should occur to every person, not just with the Genesis 6, but just generally in biblical study, if you're acquainted with this other material, and I'm talking about contemporary material. I'm not talking about medieval rabbinic discussion or early or church father discussion. I'm talking about contemporary stuff here that the New Testament writers are going to be reading and thinking about and interacting with, and older as well. And that the question is this. This should occur to everyone. Well, how in the world did the ancient people of the day get Genesis 6 so wrong? What prevented them from seeing the light of our modern interpretations of this, or like the Sethite thing that comes in the 4th century and early 5th century is its heyday, and then on. How in the world could the ancient people, I just pity them so much. They got this so wrong. Okay, if you ask that question, I hope that you see the bit of arrogance that goes with it. Okay, because this is where a lot of Christians are at even now, and I'm not saying they're bad. They're good people, but they don't stop to consider that. Wait a minute. I think that this is the Sethite thing or some other human view, and when you alert them to the fact that nobody believed that early on. I mean, even the biblical writers, say things that don't really conform to that. But then you've got all these people, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the first, how could they all miss this? How could the translators of the Septuagint never translate Nephilim with the verb pipto, which means to fall? They never translated fallen ones. They translated giants, gigantes. I mean, how could those guys have missed the fact that these weren't really giants? How could they? I mean, everybody misses it except for us. Oh, but by the grace of God, we would be as ignorant as the contemporary people who were looking at these texts. I mean, if that ought to jolt you.
It should. I mean, you look at the account in the two specific accounts. One confirming the deity of Messiah, and the other one confirming that these demons are wandering the earth looking for a host. And it can be a human or an animal. And we see the legion reference. Everybody knows the story about the man possessed and chained and barking and howling and asked its name, and he gives a Roman reference to an implication of a large number. Okay, some say the number is 6,000, some say it's 20,000, some say it's 40,000. It's a large number. It's that Talmudic question, how many angels can fit on the head of a pin? It's a large number. Okay, but they were not. They were now in one host, and they were searching for another host. They could not exist without a host. They were wandering the earth looking for a host. And so Jesus cast them into the pigs. The pigs died. But the demons did. It doesn't record the demons dying. The pigs died. You have to look past and ask the question, but people don't. The man who cleaned was possessed by a demon, was delivered, and he cleaned his house and it was empty. To me, that's always meant it wasn't filled with the Spirit of the Lord. It was empty. And so the demon went and brought 7 of his friends back, and the man was worse off than he was when he began. So looking for a host. Hey, here's a good host. Here's a nice, clean, fresh host for us to occupy and set up shop in. Okay. Now there's 8 of us. He brought 1 plus 7. 8 are now in this one man. He's worse off than before. And for me as a Jew, it became kind of clear, most clear when I stood at Banyas in Israel at Pan's temple, at the Grotto of Pan.
Is there a rock there?
Is there a rock there?
Yeah, is there a rock there?
Well, there's actually a hole in the ground. The temple's gone, but the grotto is still there, and that was
Carved
where
out of this.
and there's a hole, and that's what Jesus said, the gates of hell. And you know, Pan was this half goat, half man. We look at Esau. He was hairy. You describe a goat as hairy. You describe a sheep as woolly. Jesus gave the parable of the sheep and the goats. Are all these things connected? This worship of a false god, pandemic, panacea, pandemonium, panic, all these things that we pay homage to every time we use those words, is to a false god of fear. And so Scripture tells us who the author of fear is. And so when you connect these different parts of Scripture together with an understanding of the unseen realm of angels and demons, and we set aside what the conventional thinking of, where in the Bible does it say 2/3 of the angels fell?
You know, it's really astonishing to me, even if you think back to the Pan illustration, because Pan is quite old. I mean, you can find Pan all the way back in ancient Egypt. But how much of the imagery becomes Satan imagery, devil imagery, and both it was and it became. Within the Christian tradition, it gets picked up, and then you'll have people look at the Caesarea Philippi incident. There they are at the Grotto of Pan, and they'll say, well, no, this wasn't where the gates of hell were. It's someplace over there. Like, really? So all of this is just like one huge coincidence. And we're better off going over to Mount Tabor, where none of this stuff is there, but that's where we should be looking. you know, what, that sometimes I'm at a loss for words. Like, I just don't know what to say to stuff like that, because, like, is there some reason that this frightens you? Is there some reason that this troubles you? That the passage could actually make sense like this? Like, and so that's bothersome in some way. Um, again, for the sake of the audience, what we're suggesting is that you have to pay attention to context. The right context for interpreting scripture is not church tradition. It's not, it's no tradition or context that post dates the biblical material. Again, just like the letter from mom, you got to have mom inside your head to know what mom is saying in the letter. You got to have the first century Jew living inside your head. You've got to have the second millennium BC Israelite living in your head to help you read the Old Testament. Because the writers who live at these times are writing to their audience. They're writing to their audience. And if we want to understand what they're trying to say, we got to get back there. We got to have that, just, again, living in our head, so that we can discern more readily what it is they're trying to communicate.
This is a foundation discussion that you and I have in many different ways each time a new book comes out, to help people become equipped to embrace the new message of the new book. The only time we didn't do it was Stranger Things, because we both had so many interesting perspectives that because I was watching it, you were watching it, and we were right there together, actually postulating on what season 3 was going to be like. Mm-hmm. But if we don't lay this foundation and provoke people to say, you have to get out of the church mindset if you want to understand the scriptures. You have to know these, do a little background research, know the environment, know why it was this way at the time of this writing. Take a look at Paul's letters, and take a look at how we've made these universally doctrinal to all situations across all circumstances as universal doctrine. When, if your group is not exhibiting that behavior that he was talking about, this particular behavior, then is that really doctrinally applicable to all people in all situations at all times? And that's a real question. It's like the 613 commands of the Old Testament, the teachings. They're not commands; they're instructions. Today we're living in a world where we are commanded to follow one of the 613 instructions. It's the washing of your hands. All right. Now, for the Gentile, it says that if you do this by natural inclination, God considers it to be an act of righteousness. If you do something by nature that's in accordance with the law. For me as a Jew, okay, if I do it, yeah, it's a big deal. I don't get a good boy. All right? You get a good boy. I don't get a good boy. I don't get an attaboy. You always knew that. You were always taught that. Okay? But this is, and understanding why Paul would make that statement was to encourage people to be open to the move of the Spirit that would draw you closer to the heart of God, which was this plan to bless you, not to curse you.
Yeah, and your audience and others who wander in, who will be new, listeners, new viewers. Again, we've said this before too. Don't feel overwhelmed by this reference, on context. You live at a day and time when there's so much material that you have access to with so much speed and utility, especially like in the Bible software world. that you actually can do this. Yes, you can still buy certain books, and you could go to my website, or and see which ones I recommend for background study and all that. But especially if you get those things in digital, you can mine them for material with lightning speed. And if you just devote yourself to 5 or 10 minutes a day reading through some really, significant sources, in a year's time, you're going to have a lot upstairs as far as the context of both testaments. This actually is something you can do. You don't have to go get a degree. You don't have to, spend lots of tuition money. You don't have to do it. I mean, when I was growing up, we didn't have Bible software. I mean, I get it. There were times, when you would feel overwhelmed, but now there's so much available on any device, anywhere you're at, that you can do this. So don't be overwhelmed.
I completely agree with you, and I think that's a great way to end this segment. This is Demons Part 1. And we do this each time that Dr. Heiser releases a new book, is we lay down some foundational planks in order to establish the reference points for the depth of the text. So I always look at a part 2, often a part 3, depending on the weightiness of the matter, because I think it's much too significant a contribution to one of the books that I have now in my resource library as a reference document, because I reference your reference points as well. I reference you and your source documents that add to my repertoire of understanding. So I encourage you to get Demons, What the Bible Really Says About the Powers of Darkness. #1 new release on Amazon, #1 in 3 categories. It is something that will open your eyes, and if you will set what you thought you believed just to the side for a minute and open yourself up to a new set of tools and information, you will find yourself enlightened, re-energized, and excited about going back and learning about the scriptures that really deep in your heart you love, because if you love the Messiah, then you know that just about everything he said was straight out of the book of Deuteronomy, straight out of the mouths of the prophets, straight out of the mouth of his Father, for he said, I only say what I heard my Father say, I only do what I saw my Father do. So draw nearer to him through books like Dr. Michael Heiser's new book, Demons, What the Bible Really Says About the Powers of Darkness. Mike, so great to see you again. Look forward
to see you.
Look forward to seeing you next month. I get every single time you and I are on, I get these messages that say, can't you guys do this just like once a week? Can't you guys do this like every day? Can't we just hang out with you all the time? And you know me, I would actually really love that, but I know your time is limited, and we appreciate the hour that you give us every month.
Yep, you bet. Thank you.
God bless you. See you next month. Shalom.
You too. Shalom.
We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.